tearing me apart!
Rebel Without a Cause is one of the most iconic and enduring films ever made. Debuting in 1955, it left an indelible influence on everything from acting to literature to politics. From West Side Story to Elvis Presley to George Lucas to David Bowie, not to mention Akira, Paula Abdul, and The Room.
You are tearing me apart, Lisa!
Starring James Dean as a tortured teen lashing out at the conservative 1950s, Rebel defined the very concept of teenage rebellion.
And your folks didn't understand.
They never do.
But behind the fast cars and tough talk, at Rebel's heart is a tender friendship that's easy to read as a gay romance.
Hey, you want to come home with me? I mean, there's nobody home at my house. Heck, I'm not tired.
And although censors and studio executives issued furious demands to cut anything queer, the filmmakers loaded the film with same-sex desire, drawing on elements from their own personal lives. Together, they created a blueprint of teenage angst and desire that shaped American culture for decades to come.
I want to do something right!
This is the story of Rebel Without a Cause. Its making, the subtle queer content that they snuck past the censors, and why its spirit lives on today. So, if you've never seen it, Rebel is a story about a group of teenagers who develop an intense, all-consuming emotional bond in a highly compressed span of time while disaster looms overhead.
It's all over. The world ended.
In that sense, you can think of it as sort of like Romeo and Juliet, but set in the 1950s. 2 years before a story based on that very idea arrived on Broadway. But Rebel has a few key elements that make it more than just boy meets girl. For one thing, it's really boy meets girl and other boy.
But I'm happy now. Here.
And for another, the three main characters of Rebel have something important in common. They're all lonely outsiders, longing for someone to connect to. But they're not getting it from any of the people in their lives. And in fact, they're actively prevented from getting what they need. That's all set up in a brilliant opening scene. Here's how it plays out. The action starts late at night on Easter Sunday, 1955. The first teen is Jim, played by James Dean. Jim's family just moved to town, and he's not making a great first impression. The police found him wandering around town drunk.
You want to lean him up against something?
But he's not just intoxicated. A sympathetic cop can tell there's something upsetting him.
Things pretty rough for you at home?
Please lock me up. I'm going to hit somebody. I'm going to do something I don't...
Jim has no one he can talk to, least of all his parents. When they arrive at the police station...
What's the matter with you anyhow?
He's just loaded, honey.
I was talking to Jim.
They ignore him, they talk over him, they're mad about being called away from a party at their country club, more interested in bickering with each other than in their own kid.
I cut loose pretty good in my day, too.
Oh, really, Frank? When was that?
Can't you wait till we get home?
And, by the way, if Jim's dad seems familiar, it's Jim Bacchus, the millionaire from Gilligan's Island.
Boys love trains, my dear. No, the railroad definitely goes to Gilligan.
And the voice of Mr. Magoo.
Ah, there he is. Active little fellow. A spitting image of his father.
In other words, he's perfectly cast as a quintessential old man who doesn't have a clue about what's going on around him. Jim's parents argue in circles over him until, finally, he snaps.
You're tearing me apart!
What?
You say one thing, he says another, and everybody changes back again!
It's a shocking moment, one of the most memorable in the film. But Jim's parents still barely take notice.
That's a fine way to behave.
Well, you know who he takes after.
He tells the cop,
If I had one day when I didn't have to be all confused, I didn't have to feel that I was ashamed of everything, if I felt that I belonged someplace.
Jim just wants to figure out where he belongs, to find people who accept him. But everywhere he goes, he feels like he just doesn't fit. It's a feeling of isolation that's probably familiar to a lot of teens, then and today. But what Jim doesn't know is he's not as isolated as he thinks. There are two other troubled youth at the station that night. One of them is 16-year-old Judy, played by Natalie Wood. Like Jim, the cops picked her up because she was wandering around town in the middle of the night. And like Jim, she feels like an outsider in her own family.
He hates me.
What makes you think he hates you, Judy?
He looks at me like I was the ugliest thing in the world.
Judy wants to be more grown up, but her father gets mad when she dresses like an adult.
He grabbed my face. He started rubbing off all the lipstick.
But in a later scene, we see that her dad also gets mad when she wants the same affection that he gave her when she was young.
Girls don't love their father. Since when? Since I got to be 16?
Stop that!
Sit down.
Judy tries to put up a cool facade like it doesn't bother her, but privately,
I'll never get close to anybody.
she feels like she can't fit anywhere, that no one will ever love her. It's pretty heartbreaking. And like Jim, it's a feeling of isolation that's probably familiar to a lot of teens. And that's also the case for the third outsider at the police station. His name's John, but he goes by Plato. If Jim and Judy's parents are giving them mixed messages, Plato's parents are at least on the same page about their kid. They can't stand him.
I don't care for Joe.
Plato's dad left years ago. His mother goes on long vacations and leaves Plato behind with a nanny. But Plato is spiraling into terrible trouble. The police picked him up because he did something truly awful.
Do you have any idea why you shot those puppies, John?
If you want to set up a character as a villain in an opening scene, this is pretty much the easiest way to do it. And Plato's definitely disturbed. But he's also not entirely a villain. He's as upset as anyone else about what he did. In one version of the script, he says, "I guess I'm just no good," and explains that he saw the puppies nursing with their mother and experienced a hysterical breakdown at the sight of a mother who actually cares for her children. That certainly doesn't excuse what he did, but it at least points in a direction that might help.
Do you know if the boy ever talked to a psychiatrist?
Mrs. Crawford don't believe in them, sir.
Like the other two teens, it would probably help for Plato to have someone he could talk to about his feelings. But his mother won't let him. It's a recurring theme of the film. Adults who think they're helping, but really just getting in the way. The entire police station scene is really brilliant. We meet all three characters, and we see how similar they are. But the characters themselves don't know anything about each other. The set's designed so they can see each other through panes of glass like zoo animals. But they can't make contact. They can't talk to each other. There's just one moment of contact, when Jim sees that Plato is cold and he offers him his jacket. And watch off to the side how Judy notices Jim in her compact. But then the police immediately intervene and separate them. And that's the real tragedy of the scene. All three are upset for basically the same reason.
If I felt that I belonged someplace,
I'll never get close to anybody.
Nobody can help me.
All three think they're totally alone. If they could just hear each other, they'd realize that's not the case. But they can't. At least, not yet. We end the police station scene with everybody isolated. So, what draws them together? Well, you see that play out in the scenes that follow, starting the next morning. Jim sees Judy walking to school, and he tries to make a connection.
Hi. I've seen you before.
But Judy's not into it.
Well, stop the world.
Especially when Jim mentions that he recognizes her from the police station the previous night. Look at how nervous she gets when she realizes he saw her in a moment of vulnerability.
I know where it was.
Where what was?
Where I first saw you.
Judy doesn't want anyone to know how lonely she feels. She tries to adopt a tough persona, with one of my favorite lines in the film.
You live here, don't you?
Who lives?
She's so ridiculously over the top with her attitude that it comes around to being funny.
My whole life is a dark room.
So why is she so resistant? Because she's part of a tough crowd. They all have to show off how cool and aloof they are. Judy does the same to fit in.
What's that?
Oh, that's a new disease.
At this point, Judy's walls are up as high as they can be. She's putting up a front that she doesn't need anyone. But we know, and Jim probably suspects, that's not really true. And to his credit, Jim doesn't push it. He just watches her go, for now. And while Judy may not be ready to open up to Jim, Plato certainly is. It happens at school the next day. Plato's at his locker and he sees Jim in a mirror. It's a moment that echoes the police station when Judy first caught sight of Jim in her compact. Plato is spellbound. He can't stop staring. What's so captivating? Well, there's a clue right under the mirror in his locker. It's a picture of Alan Ladd, an actor who was in a lot of westerns, at the time considered a tough man's man, a cinema heartthrob.
I hear a lot of talk in town about you.
What kind of talk?
Well, what kind would you expect? Handsome fella like yourself. Can't stop people from talking.
Not if they've got dirty minds.
And there are a couple of ways to read that photo, and what it's there to tell us. One is that maybe Plato has it there because he wants to comb his hair, like a cinema hunk. It's the movie's way of telling us that Plato wishes he was cooler. Or maybe it's there to show that Plato wishes he had a strong male figure in his life. We know his dad left when he was young. Or it could be there for the same reason I always pick Bowser in Mario Kart. Plato just likes looking at hot men. Or maybe it's a mix of all three. Whether you interpret Plato as looking for a role model, or a mentor, or a lover, or all of the above, this one little turn of the head is pretty meaningful. From this point on, Plato stops looking at a photo for what it is that he needs. From now on, he's looking to a real person. And he's gonna pursue him. Plato makes his move later that day on a school trip to a planetarium. The planetarium show is weirdly apocalyptic, so much that it frightens Plato at one point. And there are lines that are unusually nihilistic.
Man, existing alone, seems himself an episode of little consequence.
After it's over, Jim sees that Plato was upset, and he calms him down.
Hey, it's all over. The world ended.
Plato stands up, and look at how adoring his gaze is here, and he says this.
What does he know about man alone?
Unlike Judy, Plato has no problem opening up, showing Jim that he's lonely. And Jim seems to get it. Plato's looking for companionship, Jim's looking for someone he feels like he belongs with, and they both look pretty comfortable together. They might not realize it yet, but there's a new family starting to take shape. Two lonely outcasts, together at last. But just how together are they? Well, it's not hard to see something romantic going on. At one point, a little later in the film, Plato's daydreaming out loud, and he says,
Maybe next summer he's going to take me hunting with him, and fishing. I want him to teach me how because I know he won't get mad if I goof.
In other words, he wants Jim to teach him how to be a man, and to be gentle while he does it. And on one hand, you could interpret that as Plato wanting a mentor or a father figure. But personally, I think Plato's feeling something that's more romantic, for a couple of reasons. For one thing, there's just the body language. The better they get to know each other, the closer they get physically. They lock eyes, they touch each other. There are even a few moments when Plato asks Jim to slip away with him.
I know a place where we can go. Hey, you want to come home with me? I mean, there's nobody home at my house. Heck, I'm not tired.
To me, those invitations feel like fumbling attempts at a hookup. And Jim never pushes Plato away. He likes the companionship. And then there's the intent of the filmmakers. According to the book The Unabridged James Dean, screenwriter Stuart Stern reportedly said, I wanted the role to have homosexual overtones. And in fact, James Dean loved that aspect of the script. He wanted to make it more explicit. Before Sal Mineo was cast, Dean asked if Plato could be played by his close friend, Jack Simmons. Jack had acted with Jim on television before, and he was openly gay. That was pretty unusual for the time. Depending on who you ask, Jack may also have been Dean's boyfriend. There's a lot of evidence that Dean had multiple relationships with other men, and we don't have time to go into all of them here, but I'm posting a bonus video over on Patreon where I go over exactly what we know and what we don't know about the men in James Dean's life. Another aspect that makes it seem romantic, even after the role went to Sal Mineo, James Dean still wanted to lean into the same-sex romance. He told director Nick Ray to have Plato gaze at Jim like he's in love. That was pretty easy for Sal to do because he really was in love with James Dean in real life. Sal didn't talk about that until years later, but in later interviews he said, I was incredibly in love with him. We never became lovers, he said. We could have, like that. Of course, as much as they wanted to explore the gay angle, they couldn't make it explicit. Films back then weren't allowed to have openly gay characters. Anything like that had to be hinted at very subtly, like in Hitchcock's Rope 6 years earlier.
How queer.
In fact, as they got close to shooting, censors detected the gay vibe in Rebel, and they were pissed.
He sure gives me the reds.
At the time, all films had to be approved by a body called the Production Code Administration, and they did not like what they saw. A note from the PCA read, it is of course vital that there be no inference of a questionable or homosexual relationship between Plato and Jim. Studio executives were alarmed too. In one scene, the script describes Plato and Jim falling against each other, and one executive at Warner Brothers thought that meant amorously. He wrote in the margin of the script, Jim and Plato kiss? In what must have been disbelief. To be clear, the script didn't call for a kiss, and they didn't shoot one. But I can understand why the executive thought what he did. Especially when you see the screen tests, which were filmed just days before shooting began. In those, James and Sal Mineo are even more intimate. They hold each other, they lie against each other. At one point, James nearly lands a kiss on the cheek. So, knowing how far the filmmakers wanted to push the depiction, and seeing in the screen tests how far they wanted to go, and knowing how eager James Dean was to make it gay, I'm very comfortable saying, yeah, these guys are into each other. But with Jim and Plato now coming together, there's still one person missing. Judy. She's still running around with that tough crowd, and something's going to have to change for her to open up to Jim. And change it does. The gang's decided they don't like Plato or Jim, and their leader, Buzz, challenges Jim to a fight.
Come on, give him a knife.
Pick it up.
I don't want any trouble.
Take a look at this important difference between Jim and Buzz. Where Jim is honest and open and sincere about his feelings,
I think that you can't just go around proving things and pretending like you're tough.
Buzz is all swagger. He's putting on a show. He's a phony. In fact, when nobody else is around, he even admits to Jim,
You know something?
I like you.
That really highlights the distinction between them. Jim has no problem saying how he feels. And that's something that Judy starts to notice and appreciate.
What's he like?
He's sincere.
Well, that's the main thing.
But Buzz, everything he does is for show. And that turns out to be his undoing. He challenges Jim to a game of chicken. They have to drive toward a cliff, and the first one to jump out of the car is the loser. But during the game, Buzz plunges to his death because his extremely cool jacket gets caught in the car door. It's his own fault. He wanted to impress everyone, and he paid a terrible price. And that changes things. The rest of the gang, for all their tough guy swagger, are terrified, and they flee. Only 3 people are left behind: Judy, Jim, and Plato. Jim knows they're all traumatized, especially Judy, who just saw her boyfriend die. He sees her staring over the cliff, and watch how he takes her hand, with Plato standing between them. He gives her a little shake of the head. It's like he's afraid she might jump, and he's pulling her back from the edge. He's rescuing her. Earlier that day, Judy pushed him away, in part because she knew he'd seen her at her most vulnerable. Now he's seeing her even more vulnerable. And this time, she takes his hand. Now we've got our family. Plato's found someone to look up to, Judy's found someone who understands her, and Jim has found people who accept him. All 3 are starting to look out for each other. And they're going to need that support, because they're about to face a world that is very much against them. So why does it feel like the world is out to get them? And you can find the answer to that by looking at how the adults treat them. After the incident at the cliff, Jim turns to his parents for help. But
well, far be it from me to tell you what to do.
Oh, are you going to preach? Do we have to listen to a sermon now?
They are totally unhelpful. His dad is weak and cowardly. His mom is domineering, aggressive.
Do you enjoy doing this to me or what?
This aspect of the film doesn't age great. Back in the 1950s, people thought men should be assertive and women submissive, and that if they failed to live up to those roles, that their kids could become abnormal. At one point, the film shows the dad wearing an apron, and Jim freaks out.
You shouldn't.
At another point, Jim has an unbelievable suggestion.
If he had guts to knock Mom cold once, then maybe she'd be happy and then she'd stop picking on him.
That line is just awful. And so is the way that the film seems to blame Jim's problems on his parents not living up to traditional gender roles. That's a reflection of the sexism of the time. Back then, audiences would have taken it as a sign that Jim's parents were failing him. But today, it just comes off as terrible. And it's especially unfortunate because the parents have some much more legitimate problems, like how they don't listen to their kid, they don't take Jim seriously, and they give him terrible advice. When Jim asks his dad if he should participate in the game of chicken,
we've got to consider all the pros and cons. I'll get some paper and we'll make a list.
That advice is so out of touch, it's just funny. And then later, when Jim comes back and tells his parents that someone died,
I don't want you to go to the police. There were other people. Why should you be the only one involved?
His parents make a bonkers suggestion that he should just act like everything's fine.
Just tell a little white lie.
You'll learn when you're older, Jim.
Or that maybe they could just run away from their problems.
Well, it doesn't matter anyway because we're moving.
Even when Jim tells them exactly what he needs from them, their reaction is totally unhelpful, out of touch. It's like they're dealing with someone from a totally different culture. Because in a sense, they are. Rebel reflects a real-life cultural shift that was happening in the US in the 1950s with teenagers at the center. This movie came along just when the world was totally changing for people in their teens. When Jim's parents were young, the idea of teenagers didn't really exist. People tended to think of kids going straight from childhood to adulthood. And it wasn't until the 1940s that they started thinking of teen years as something unique. And some of that's because of the baby boom. There were a ton of births starting in the 1940s, and by the mid-50s, there were more teenagers than ever before. Eventually, their numbers doubled. There were so many teens, it was kind of overwhelming.
May I have your attention? May I have your attention? Oh, what the heck?
And that's not all. After the Depression and World Wars, the US had a period of affluence, and that extended to teens.
Don't I buy everything you want? A bicycle, you get a bicycle. A car?
You buy me many things.
Not only were there more of them, but now they had a lot more money than they used to. And that meant that companies saw an opportunity to make money. There was a huge rise in products for teens, especially entertainment. Before this, entertainment had previously focused either on small children or adults. Movie magazines of the 1930s tend not to show teenagers at all. When they covered youth, they're usually talking about people in their 20s. Before the 50s, if you thought of a leading man, it was probably somebody rugged, even middle-aged. But as teens got more numerous and more affluent, those old leading men went out the window. The new style was sci guys, men who were younger, smaller, more boyish, like Tab Hunter, Roddy McDowall, and especially James Dean.
He's different.
That's right. I'm cute, too.
Movies, TV shows, music couldn't churn out teen stars like Dean fast enough. It was the start of what we now recognize as youth culture. Something that the parents in Rebel just have no basis for comparison from their own childhood. And then there was one more big change. Technology. More people had home phones, radios were smaller, cars were cheap enough that teenagers could buy them used. All of those things existed before the 1950s, but this was the first time that they were so readily available and such a big part of teenagers' lives. You can see that reflected in the film. The teenagers used cars to go wherever they want, often with the adults watching in dismay. Jim phones Judy to figure out their next steps, although her dad is pissed about it. And watch how the gang uses a radio call-in show to issue a threat to Jim.
This time from the boys down at Anna's Pizza Paradise. Jim, this is dedicated to you from Buzz.
They can communicate with each other and get around in ways that previous generations never could. And the adults in their lives either have no idea what the kids are getting up to, or they're scared by it. And that reflects something that was happening in real life. A widespread belief that the upcoming generation was violent, sexual, even perverse. In 1954, a Senate subcommittee on juvenile delinquency was formed, and experts testified that America's modern youth lived in an atmosphere of deceit and cruelty.
The FBI tells us that 50% of those arrested for serious crimes are under 21.
That wasn't the only source of moral panic. A year before Rebel, there was a bombshell book called Seduction of the Innocent, which claimed that comic books were turning kids into violent monsters. Jim even makes a sarcastic reference to comics at one point when the gang confronts him.
You know something?
No, what?
You read too many comic books.
There were articles about how teens all had switchblades with headlines like, "The Toy That Kills." And sure enough, switchblades are a major plot point in Rebel.
I thought only punks fought with knives.
And of course, there was a fear that teenagers were being seduced into homosexuality.
Today's youth can be stimulated to enter the world of homosexuals. They tell youngsters that it's smart, it's thrilling, it provides kicks to be a homosexual.
Now, a lot of that moral panic was simply made up. Seduction of the Innocent, for example, was full of faulty statistics and made-up stories. The book claimed that comics condone homosexuality, and their only evidence was pointing to the relationship between Batman and Robin. But the facts didn't matter to the moral panic. In general, mainstream culture saw teenagers as the enemy, a problem that needed to be fixed. Judy's dad even says as much.
I don't know what to do. All of a sudden, she's a problem.
Of course, the adults never stopped to consider whether the problem might be them.
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong.
In that climate, you can see Rebel as a response to the moral panic. In the film, teen delinquency is shown to be a misunderstanding, at least for our main characters. Jim, Judy, and Plato don't get into trouble because they want to. It's because the world has changed and they don't know what their place in it is. And when they beg the adults for help...
Mom, I want to do something right.
This is all going too fast for me.
You better give me something. You better give me something fast.
They get nothing from their parents, who have no idea what kind of world their kids are living in, and either dismiss them.
When you're older, you'll look back at this and you'll laugh at yourself for thinking that this is so important.
Or just assume they're up to no good.
And I ran out of that house.
Is that why you were wandering around at 1 o'clock in the morning? Weren't looking for company, were you?
After Jim's parents tell him to deal with the car crash by basically pretending it didn't happen, it's clear to him he can't expect any help from his folks. He feels a lot more confident, though, about Judy and Plato. Even though he's only known them for a few hours, at least they understand what he's going through. But now that they've got each other, now what? Well, in the next few scenes, we see them figure out what they want their lives together to be. As far as their home life is concerned, they never want to go back. Plato knows a place they can go, an old abandoned mansion up in the hills. And by the way, this was an actual abandoned mansion in Los Angeles. It's the same creepy house that they used to shoot Sunset Boulevard. At one point, it sat empty for so long, locals started calling it the Phantom House. So it's a perfect place for these characters to go. They feel abandoned by the world, so they find a house that feels that way too. Listen to how they talk to each other once they're there.
What do you think of my castle?
I think we'll take it for the summer. Would you like to rent it? Or are you more in the mood to buy, dear?
You decide, darling.
They're pretending to be a family, making fun of the families that failed them.
What about
Children? See, we really don't encourage them. They're so noisy and troublesome.
And also making fun of how their parents treated them.
If you have children, you'll find that this is a wonderful arrangement. If you lock them in, you'll never have to see them again, much less talk to them.
talk to them? Heavens.
Nobody talks to children.
No.
And check out this incredible line that was improvised by James Dean.
I don't know what to do when they cry. Do you, dear?
Round them like puppies.
It's such a weird voice. What is he doing? It's an impression of the cartoon character Mr. Magoo.
Cheap pen. I liked it much better when we wrote with feathers when they...
Once more, please.
And Mr. Magoo was voiced by Jim Backus, the actor who plays Jim's dad in the film. It's a bizarre meta moment that emphasizes how their parents are literally cartoonishly out of touch. But the important thing to watch here is just how comfortable they can be around each other. They're pretending to be a family, and without realizing it, they're not just pretending. They're giving each other everything they want from a family. Love, support, respect, optimism about the future.
But I'm happy now. Here. Oh, I wish we could stay here.
This is the first time we've seen any of them, especially Plato, feeling so happy and safe. He's so content, he falls asleep. And while Plato snoozes, listen to how Jim and Judy open up to each other.
All the time I've been looking for someone to love me, and now I love somebody.
They both felt so unlovable before, and now?
And it's so easy. Why is it easy now?
I think that's kind of a heartbreaking line. Judy had gotten so used to feeling unwanted, she thought that loving somebody was hard to do. And now she's discovered it's not. It's just a matter of finding the right person. And once you find them, there's nothing to it. There's another big moment in this scene when Judy asks Jim if he knows what women like.
A man?
Yes. But a man who can be gentle and sweet.
Yeah.
Like you are.
That's huge. Remember, at the time, people thought that men should be dominant, aggressive, unemotional. The kind of person her dad is, the kind of guys she followed around in the gang. Now she's discovered something that she thinks is better. A kind of masculinity that treats her with respect. And not just her. There's a really interesting moment in the scene where the actors change something in the original script. Judy's telling Jim why she likes him. And originally, she was supposed to say that it was nice of Jim to let Plato have a candle so he could see. Just a small gesture, not a huge deal. But when it came time to shoot, here's what Judy says instead.
Like being Plato's friend when nobody else liked him. That's being strong.
With this new line, Judy's acknowledging Plato has issues. People don't like him. Of the three of them, he's probably the most troubled, the hardest to love, and he's experienced the most rejection. But not only does Jim show understanding, he gives Plato affection, and Judy calls that strong. Remember, she used to look up to strength that meant keeping people at a distance, swaggering, acting tough. But now she's seen Jim stand up for someone that he likes, even though it meant going against the rest of the crowd. And she realizes that takes bravery. More bravery than just acting tough. Jim's kindness to her is strength. That's what she wants. That's what they all want, someone to be kind to them. This empty, abandoned house is sort of like a laboratory for them to figure out what kind of life they truly want. They've taken themselves out of the world they used to be stuck in, the one that no longer worked for them, and they're figuring out what they really need instead. Essentially, that's a family that's better than the ones that they came from. And if they could just shut out the people who don't accept them, they might be okay. But the world isn't ready to leave them alone. Buzz's friends are scared that Jim will tell the police what happened, and they're out looking for Jim and Judy and Plato. And by the way, if one of these kids looks familiar, perhaps you're familiar with his later work.
You must be the great Koopa.
Anyway, the gang find Plato's address book. That leads the gang to the mansion. They arrive, they corner Plato, and he escapes, still carrying his mother's gun. He fires a few times in self-defense, and that gets the attention of some nearby cops. Throughout the film, we've seen adults constantly assume kids are a threat, especially the police. Now that Plato's fired a gun, that's all the justification they need to go after him. The cops chase Plato up the hill. They even try to shoot him in the back while he's running away, which is nuts. They're about as competent with guns as the cops in Plan 9 from outer space.
Get back up the car and get on the radio. Tell the coroner he's got to make another trip out here.
Plato makes it up the hill to the planetarium and hides inside. More cops arrive, which doesn't bode well. And while they mill around outside trying to figure out what to do, Jim and Judy go after their friend and try to help.
Plato, you're in there? You're my friend. That means a lot to me.
They actually do a great job of handling things. Jim finds Plato, and he knows just what to say. Jim reminds Plato how much they care for him.
Judy's here. She's waiting. Come on.
He gets Plato calmed down.
Not ready to come out yet?
Oh.
No? Okay. Promise you nothing will happen if you do.
He even gives Plato his jacket, a callback to the first scene at the police station when Plato refused Jim's hand. But this time, he takes it.
It's warm.
Can I keep it?
Well, what do you think?
And crucially, while they're talking, Jim manages to slip the bullets out of Plato's gun. So far, so good. Jim steps out to show the cops that he emptied the magazine.
Don't have to worry about anything. Here, Ray, keep the guys back.
Then he guides Plato to the door. It's an amazing de-escalation. Jim's showing the adults a better way to deal with problems. Not with violence, but by talking and listening. But do the cops care? As soon as Plato arrives at the door, all they see is a threat. They blind him with lights, he runs in a panic, and then... It's devastating. And the worst part, it's so unnecessary.
I got the bullets!
Of all of them, Plato probably yearned for connection the most. And he'd finally found it with people who understood him. And then they lost him so horribly.
This poor baby got nobody. Just nobody.
Sal Mineo later said that when they shot that scene, and when he saw the grief that James Dean mustered to mourn Plato, I understood what being loved meant.
He's always cold.
For all the talk about how violent and dangerous the youth are, in the end, it's the adults who commit homicide. As endings go, it's horrible, tragic. And when the reviewers at the Production Code Administration saw it, they called the ending more or less happy. Why on earth would they call cops killing a kid a more or less happy ending? Well, because according to the PCA, he more or less deserved it. In those days, any movie character who committed a crime had to be punished in the end. And when you look at the PCA's notes, they only felt that there was one crime committed in the entire film: juvenile delinquency. And the notes go on that for the crime, Plato is punished by law. That's justice by the PCA's logic. Plato's dead, moral order's restored, and that makes it, to the PCA, a happy ending. The film even shows Jim's parents exchange a smile with each other after it's all done. Now, I certainly don't agree that this is a more or less happy ending. That is insane. But I also don't think Rebel is entirely sad. It has more going on than just a teenage tragedy. And I think that's why the film spoke to so many people, first when it came out, and then in the years and decades that followed. From the moment of its release, audiences saw something special in this film. The New York Times called it a picture to make the hair stand on end. Teenagers flocked to see it in droves, in part because it was one of the first movies to show the world from a teenage perspective, to take them seriously. Teenagers started dressing like Jim, quoting the film, using it to explain their own lives. Unfortunately, James Dean never got to see the impact that Rebel had. Just a few weeks before it opened, he was driving down a California highway, crashed his car, and he died instantly. Just like that, James Dean was gone. But his importance to audiences lived on. There were tributes, memorials, fan clubs devoted to continuing his memory. They called themselves Deaners. For many, it was as much a part of their identity as being teens. Even a year after he died, Warner Brothers was still getting 8,000 letters a month from teenagers writing to say how much he meant to them. One fan's letter explained it. To us teenagers, Dean was a symbol of the fight to make a place for ourselves in the world of adults. So what was it about this movie? What was it about this actor that made them such an important symbol? Screenwriter Stuart Stern suggested it's because the film is a plea for compassion. That's why kids love it, he said. It's a film that says someone has value, though he may not think he has. And I think he's absolutely right, because when I watch Rebel, the moments that stick out to me are the moments when someone is kind or makes a connection. When Jim comforts Plato in the planetarium. When Judy sees someone who might understand and respect her, and Jim pulls her back from the edge. When all three of them are happy together, imagining how much better their lives could be, realizing that they're not alone, they're not unlovable, that they found each other and they can care for each other. Those moments are especially compelling to me because that story, outsiders finding love in a world that's against them is such a familiar queer narrative. People who thought that they were the only one of their kind, that nobody would ever accept them, finding each other and creating something better. It's so easy to relate to characters like that, even when they're not explicitly gay, even across decades or genres, from stories like Rebel Without a Cause to The X-Men.
The X-Men are my family now, and members of a family help each other.
I think that's a big reason why Rebel struck such a chord when it came out. For whatever reason someone felt like an outcast, gay or straight, the film is a reminder you're not alone. And I think Natalie Wood said it best. She was asked why the film is so enduring, and she credited it to James Dean's performance and what he was trying to say through the character of Jim.
At the time, he seemed like a great nonconformist and a great rebel and an eccentric and all of that. But really, he was just trying to get that connection. He was really saying, listen to me, hear me, love me.
Now, there are lots more great stories about Rebel that I didn't have room for in this video, but I'm posting those in bonus videos over on Patreon. I've got one about the many men and maybe boyfriends in James Dean's life. I've got another about his friendship with Vampira, the woman who inspired Elvira, and about the time that he played Frankenstein in a play called Goon with the Wind. I've got all that and lots more at patreon.com/mattbaum. And if you like stories about the making of iconic pop culture, check out my book, Hi Honey, I'm Homo. It's all about queer characters on American sitcoms from the 60s to today. It's out in ebook, audiobook, and print, and you can get a signed copy at gaysitcoms.com. For even more about the history of great movies and TV shows, check out my weekly newsletter. You can sign up for that at mattbaum.com. And join me for weekly live streams over on Twitch. That's at twitch.tv/mattbaum. Big thanks to everybody who helped me with this video, especially the folks at the Margaret Herrick Library at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Thanks to Christopher Bonanos, city editor at New York Magazine. You can check him out at Old NY Mag on Instagram. Thanks to Jason Colavito for all of his expertise on the life of James Dean. And huge thanks to everybody who makes these videos possible on Patreon. Now, if you'll excuse me, there are some troubled youths who need my attention.
Michelangelo, there's a barrel of silicone lubricant over there. Use it to give him a slip.
Cowabunga!